So, David Osborne, let's start with a simple question that opens up the whole subject of physical and visual comedy in animation. Who are your top three comedians, and what do they reveal about how comedy works on screen?
Well, I think the three comedians that I have in mind, one is not really strictly speaking a comedian, but I would describe him as a visual artist that both you and I would admire. And that person would be Tex Avery. I think his contribution to animation and also a type of humor, which I think, I guess the screwball humor that we would recognize from the films of the 1940s and 50s that he directed, and the sort of surreal element. I think he took it to quite an extreme, and I think it had a big influence across both animation and actual other forms of physical comedy. I'm going to say Jacques Tati as well because he's one of my great heroes. I like the observational comedy. I like the simplicity about what he does quite often, and the fact that he does it in a very well observed way. I mean, there's plenty of examples on YouTube if you've not come across Jacques Tati, and I would certainly go and have a dig around on YouTube. But yeah, for me, he's one of the great heroes of comedy. And my final hero is somebody I've actually been fortunate enough to work with, and that's Rowan Atkinson, because I think he's probably is still currently one of the greatest comedians around at the moment. Still, certainly in the UK, and I think internationally, I know he's very well recognised, and I think he can do things that other comedians just cannot do. He is genuinely brilliant. There isn't much more to add to that particular accolade.
Some fantastic choices. Well done. So, welcome to Director's Cut Animated Vision.
Hello, and my name is Dave Osborne, and I've been directing for over 30 years, and I am known for shows like Super Team 4 and Lego's Nexo Night, and of course, especially applicable for this particular episode, Mr. Bean, the animated series.
And I am Stuart Evans, and I've been directing for 30 years. And my largest show to date has been the CG version of Bob the Builder, 104 episodes. Goodness me, that's a lot. And I've also worked on 2D and in physical comedy shows with non-dialogue. So I know a little bit about this myself, but it's all going to be about this man here. So, our subject this week is physical and visual comedy in animation. Let's define the terms. What's the difference for you between visual comedy and physical comedy?
So for me, visual comedy is the broader sort of category. It includes things like working with props. It includes performance, and it probably includes everything else that's around that. You know, whether it's bits of visual things that are in the background or whatever, or whether it's just, for example, like John Cleese and Michael Palin in the very famous little fish dancing that they do on the side of the quay, where he comes out with a little fish, Michael Palin, and he slaps John Cleese around the face, and then John Cleese pulls out this massive, great fish and slaps him straight into the water. You know, there's anything like that at all. That's that kind of broader subject of visual comedy. I think, you know, the other side of things that you might say are performance-based comedy, I would say and the physical comedy things are probably things like Jacques Tati and Rowan Atkinson, where we have that more intimate thing where you have facial expressions and perhaps just things being done with how the body is working and moving.
How do you develop a physical or visual gag from a script all the way through to the screen?
Well, first of all, my process is you've got to hope there's something in the script to find like that. I think having worked quite a bit with the animated Mr. Bean series, we certainly lay out in that process a lot of the ideas, the visual ideas in the script. It's got to be there from that onset. That doesn't mean we're not developing it as we go through the process. So to give you an example, there was a gag that we did on series 3, and I suppose it is a gag. It's little bit more than that, really. I suppose it's a whole little scene on its own where Bean is bored in the car. He's waiting to pick Mrs. Wicked up, and he's trying to entertain himself. And having tried the radio a few times and there's nothing he wants to listen to, he starts to entertain himself by sort of humming a tune. And in doing so, he gets kind of involved in the process and starts playing the car like an instrument. So he's wiggling the windscreen wipers in time to the his singing and humming, and he's kind of opening the car doors as like percussive sounds, tapping the roof, and turning on the lights so that you get all of this is happening in time to this little tune that he's humming. It's a piece of animation that I really adore. Actually, it makes me laugh every time I watch it. And I think on the script, what we had at that stage was, I think it was along the lines of Bean is bored and starts to tap a musical sound out on the car. I think it wasn't much more than that. I always felt there was something more we could do with it, and so fairly early on, and that was the sort of brief I gave the board artist. I said, let's look at doing something with, give me the visual options to be able to do things like wiggling a windscreen wiper stem, whatever you call it. And also because it's the car on Bean, we always have a slight limitation because it's either a 2D object for us, although I know for everybody who watches it all looks like 2D, or it's a 3D object. And generally, I'm not allowed to do many 3D scenes with the car because that becomes more expensive. So we have to usually save that for driving and doing things. This was all going to be static. And so that was all blocked out. And originally, I thought it should be something fairly big in terms of the musicality, something, an orchestrated idea that Bean would be able to hum. It had to be something that we could do in terms of the rights. When we came to record the audio, and that meant actually humming something, and that meant, asking Rowan Atkinson to hum something, he had his own thoughts to the visual side of that, and he brought in the piece of music that we did eventually use, which is interesting because it was Colonel Bogey. If you hum Colonel Bogey correctly, it gives you beats per minute of about 120, which is ideal for working out animation walks. And it was
Ah,
one thing that
okay.
Richard Williams used to teach in his classes that he did. And of course, we had to then check whether we had any rights issues in that, which we didn't. It was okay. And so he basically then hummed it, kind of a little section. And so the audio, then we took that back into the picture side of things, having boarded it all out, and then we reworked it in the edit. And that probably took us several passes to block it all through. And, coming up with extra little ideas visually that we thought, okay, we can add that now, we could add that. So it was okay. It was kind of there-ish at the beginning in terms of a fundamental idea in the script, but it certainly took the performance of both the storyboard and the performer himself to actually kind of bring all those bits in. I kind of knew from the script what I was wanting to do with it, that I wanted to do this kind of slightly absurd musical, I'm bored, entertaining myself thing. But it took a long time to process itself through. I never thought I know exactly what it's going to look like in my head at the end, but I did know where it was going all the time.
When you see on a script that there is a visual gag, would you rather that it was quite sparse in its description, or do you find that it's best to have from the writer as much detail as possible?
I quite enjoy being inspired, if that makes sense. I quite enjoy where perhaps there's only the nuts and bolts. Does that make sense? That you get
Hmm.
enough information that you go, okay, I can build onto this. And
Yeah.
especially working with the team that we usually have on beat, we have board artists that are quite visually adept. They know why they're there. They're there to help produce physical and visual comedy. And also, again, with the lead star that we have involved in the process, you know, he's going to have a perspective on it, and he will bring a layer of understanding and genius sometimes, absolute genius sometimes into that, and make suggestions along the way. So I quite like the organic approach, especially on something as big as that. I think it's quite nice to slowly develop it, which is almost like a theatrical thing. Um, um, and you're trying to capture both good planning, That's my view. You're trying to guide something in terms of good planning. A little bit of that sort of thing where you get the happy accident when somebody tries something and finds something. I think you want a little bit of that as well. Um, so there's a mixture of things. I will act things out at home. To the extent that one of the things that we did on one of the episodes, again, probably we'll go in later onto things like safety and whatever. Bean is hanging off the roof, and before going in to do the recording of that, we had the storyboard, so I knew physically roughly what we were trying to do. I actually climbed up onto my shed roof and hung off the roof in the similar fashion to see how much and where my body weight was, so I could understand at what point I would tip and fall, how much pressure I needed to apply to myself to hold on to this bloody roof without falling. I mean, my approach on it is I like to work out the physical stuff by trying it. And then you learn things. You get that little bit of exploration involved as well. And then I think then the whole process, as you go through working with both the performer and then into layout and animation, at every point when you're briefing into people that have got to recreate these moments, you do have that understanding. And I think that's something, and I'm sure there are other directors and other approaches, don't get me wrong, but this is my approach, that I feel that by having the understanding of what it is to try this and understand, what the body is doing physically, I will actually be able to make a better call in terms of actually giving advice and feedback to somebody who's perhaps having to do more imagination. I mean, if you think about it, the voice artist will, even if they've got to make sounds like ooh and ouch and whatever, you've got to be able to give them the visual clues about what sort of pain it is that they're in. So from that perspective, I think it's quite a useful approach.
But it's very interesting with you talking about that and testing it out, and then Rowan coming in and just saying, "Okay, so now you've done that, I know that I can do that." But because so many people who are not in the industry, just regular audience members, will say, "Yes, but you can do anything because it's a cartoon." But the thing with physical comedy in cartoon, well, it's not live action, but in animation, is that if it's going to work properly, you have to apply real life physical forces to that. Otherwise, it's not going to be believable. You won't get the weight, the drop, or anything like that. You can slightly suspend disbelief. So you've got Wile E. Coyote hanging in the air, but you know he's going to drop. So you are applying those forces, but you're just sort of pushing them ever so slightly, but you are keeping the real world physics. You have to bring all that in because otherwise the physical comedy is just not going to work in animation.
I agree with all of that. And I think that to me, with the physical comedy and the visual comedy, there are two forms of gags that work within across that world. One is the possible gags, and the other is the impossible gags. There are two different spectrums. You have, somebody like Jacques Tati and, probably Rowan Atkinson as well, who are on that sort of possible gag hook. And then on the other hook, you have somebody like Tex Avery, who will, have a character fall off a cliff and bounce right back up. From that perspective, if Jacques Tati falls off something, he will hit the ground and it will hurt, and the comedy will probably be about how he responds to that. And so, with Mr. Bean, for example, you have a set of rules. Now, they're not really written down, but there are a set of rules that all of us, both on the directing side and the animation side of it and the performance side of it and the executive producer side of it, we all kind of, and the writers, of course, all collectively sort of have a sense of what the rules are. And we know that when we're probably putting an idea out there that's on the margin of the rules, or maybe even stepping on the boundary or out of the boundary,
But would you say that storyboarding and briefing a storyboard artist and the role of acting the whole thing out is absolutely key? How much of a physical comedy sequence is from the storyboard and the director, and how much is input from the performer?
In terms of briefing, I think, yes. I mean, I try to, by the time I'm talking to the board artist, I would have been through the writing process of the script. So I understand, having worked with the writers and the production, I know where, for example, where the humor should be. I hope I do at that point. Um, and you're trying to bring the storyboard artist to that point. To a certain extent, we are quite on something like Mr. Bean, the animated TV series. It's quite script driven in terms of we do work very heavily on that side of it. Um, we've also got this legacy of all the previous material, both the animated and also the live action, which is kind of unique. And we do look at that again and we think, oh, we did these sort of ideas in series 3 or series 2, or, in the live action, there was this particular episode. So that had these ideas. So we're kind of, you've got a little reference library in your head, as well as, coming through and thinking, what can I do that's new with this? And you're hoping to find something every time that's a little bit fresh, a little bit different, and that makes you engage. Me, even as the director, hopefully the storyboard artist. So there's that aspect of it, that you're trying to find that. I mean, there are little rules, and as you're probably, the rule of 3 in terms of comedy. You do it twice, and on the third one, that's the one where he gets hit on the head or whatever it is. Um, I think there is another thing that I also find is that you need to be able to put the audience into a position where they are either in front or behind. So if you put something rhythmically down, in terms of you're perhaps trying to give each idea the same amount of time, so it's got that rhythm to it. It doesn't have to be fast. Comedy doesn't have to be fast at all to be funny. And I know some people like it to be fast, but I think it actually works better sometimes when it's slower, and you've got a chance for the audience to go, yeah, I know what's going to happen. I know what's going to happen. I know what's going to happen. Yes, yes. Bang. So I think there's that aspect of it where you try. That's certainly something when you're looking at animatic, and something I will do is I'll put temporary music down to give me some rhythms to work, or rather the editor will put some temporary music down to make the rhythms work, so that we get some things to actually lay out the visual ideas too, so that we can get that kind of dum de dum de dum de dum bang. So we can get some of that worked out and get those rhythms going into the storytelling. um, you are sort of also, clearly different performers bring different aspects to the kind of visual, performance element of it. you know Working with other voice actors and whatever, you will find, they've got their own approaches, apart from, say, somebody like Rowan or whatever. And that you work with all of those, and you kind of have to adapt your approach a little bit. Maybe, they are looking at purely at the script usually, quite often, so they're not necessarily seeing all the visual impact or input that I've seen. So you're trying to feed them that information as well. How big's that cliff that they're stood on? Is it a really big cliff, in which case how much fear they need, or whatever, or vice, whatever. All of those things that you're trying to work out along those processes. And equally, going into animation, you you by the point that you're heading into animation, if I'm honest, I usually got a fairly clear idea of what I'm striving for now. But equally, I still want to give a little bit of that space, just to give us that final phase. Certainly with television animation, we really kind of get 1, 2 goes at it. You get a second retake, third retake if you're kind of really lucky on the budget, depending on where you are. So you kind of got to have a pretty clear idea where it's going. But equally, you will notice and you will read animators who can just lift it. And sometimes it's not big physical things. On one of the episodes, there was a point where Irma, his Bean's long-term girlfriend had a major scare, and she just looks at him, and there's just this moment of like realization. There's almost no animation in it at all. It's just almost purely one expression. And the animator, and she's like running, stops, looks, has this moment, and then moves off again. He timed it perfectly. I mean, yes, he'd worked with the animatic, but clearly he knew the exact frame to pull the head around and start to have it run off, because it just made it very funny. It brought, you knew what she was thinking, um, and all of those things. And that's something at the end of it you do need the animator to have got right. I mean, sure, as director, I might look at it and later on and say, oh, you know what, another 2 frames. Can we try another 2 frames on that look? And it might just improve it. It might just tweak it. But on that first pass, on that first watch, you went, yeah, it made me laugh. And that was an important thing. I think the other thing with comedy as well, I think it's reaction. You've obviously got a taste, a personal taste, but I think the other part of it with physical comedy is be in a room, watch the animatic with other people if you can, because you want to see what they're laughing at, especially if perhaps it's the first time they've watched the animatic, say from having read the script, or maybe you want to see what their reactions are. You want to see, has it made them smile, has it made them giggle, are they confused by something? So you're looking for all of that in that process. Yeah.
With that in mind, so if you are playing an animatic and you think, okay, here's my intention, and people are confused, they don't get it, it's really not landing. When do you actually decide that a gag has to go, that you can't really squeeze any more out of it, you can't fix it with timing, you just say it just didn't land?
One of the things that you've got to be conscious with that is, the first thing to probably check is what else is the audience dealing with at that particular point in that moment. And I feel one of the things I tend to look at immediately is go, is there music or sound effects, or is there verbal information coming across at this point? Is there something else that's distracting us from the payoff of the visual gag or the physical gag? So I think that's one thing to consider is, is there a sound effect that you've got, or you've got something going on in the atmos track that you really needed, to help give the idea that the space was X, Y, Z, or whatever it is. So I think that's quite often something I will look at first before kind of concluding the next phase. I mean, and it sort of goes on to something else as well, which is actually, do you have time to do the idea? There's an aspect of that as well. Have you given it enough time to make it work? And I think that's something always worth considering. If something's not landing, what is it that you're not doing, or the audience is not getting? So I would always consider that. Is it needs to be longer? And then I think in the final thing, you've got to be brave sometimes, and you have to kill your darlings, as they say. You have to go in and go, um, you know, cut it.
Yeah.
And you can have, I've done it at a point where there's animation, and you go, oh god, some poor person's, animated it, we've laid it out, it's been storyboard, lots of people approved it, and it doesn't work, and it's not
Yeah.
funny, or it's not gelling, or it's not delivering what we thought it was going to deliver. um and I think whilst that can be, that in a way is a failure or a tragedy, it's not. It is from terms of production, in terms of you've spent money that's not going to end up on the screen. Um, but it is a way of making things better, and I'm always, I'm never surprised, or I am surprised in equal measures, of what happens when you do cut something out, and then suddenly you go, oh, this now works. Suddenly the story flows
Mm.
and it moves on,
Yeah,
and I
that
think it.
that's the thing. If there's a gag in there, that puts a handbrake on everything, and you go, it feels uncomfortable because it's like it's been dropped in and just sort of literally shoehorned in. It's not. It doesn't feel like it flows. It's not a natural part of the story. It's just, yeah, I've got a great gag. Yeah, but it's not. it's just not going to fit. Just log it. Just put it in the library. Don't use it here. Use it on the next show. It's your call. It's your call as director. Just say, I'm going to call it. It's gone.
And I think actually, in some respects, it's probably one of the most important functions of a director to actually make those sort of calls.
Yeah.
To actually go, okay, this does not work. I cannot make it work unless we go back and rewrite. That is an option if you're doing perhaps a feature film with a large budget, but it's probably not such an option if you're doing a television series. And my experience also is quite often when you do take something else that's not functioning, you suddenly do go, okay, this is all flowing a lot better, and suddenly you understand the story a lot more, and so yeah, I agree. I think and yeah, absolutely. I have a whole library of jokes and visual ideas in my head, and they're all you look at something and you think, yeah, I could use that here or whatever, from a past thing, and you try things and it works, and lots of jokes are recycled in different ways. So I don't think that's the end of the world. There's, as they always say, there's nothing new. But I do feel that, yeah, it's important to have the ability and also the guts to cut it.
And this is the $64,000 question to end on. What, in your opinion, actually makes something funny? It's a big one. Oh, off you go.
I think sometimes thinking about things can make it unfunny. That's for sure. I think one of the things, the little lesson I learned very early on when I was a student, and I made a film about privatization of all things, and
That
it was
sounds
it was
hilarious.
it was hilarious. I can assure you, laugh a moment it was. Um, okay. One of the things, and I was sat there and I was thinking, I need a, I need a, I need a joke. I needed a joke in the visual side of things where this character that had gone through all of these things he was searching for air because the story was about the privatization of air. One of the things I wanted to express and show was actually I thought what was going to happen was, at the end of it, ordinary people would become subject to exploitation. And I had this kind of guy on the street corner with a big coat on, doing the sort of, he's selling something. And every character in my story had an oxygen tank and a mask because you had to buy your air. And he was selling air, but of course it was dodgy air. And I was thinking, well, what would be obvious to an audience that it was bad air? Because I couldn't, you can't breathe it in that sense, or that all of this is a scam. And so in the end, I had this idea. Well, where is there no air? And I was asking myself all these questions, and that was the one that came up. And I thought, the moon. There's no air on the moon. Okay, so this guy is selling moon air. It's a con. And and so he opens this coat and he shows he's got these canisters of moon air on, and says, do you want to buy one? And they go, oh no, anyway, that was a joke. And when I had the review for it, the lecturer said, oh, that's quite funny. And I thought, good. That's the object of the idea. But equally, it made me understand the structure of what it was. And that was really, it was about an opposite. It was about asking yourself questions about how you could find a contrast to something. And I think a lot of humor revolves around contrast. And I think that's something that you need to look for in ideas, certainly visual ideas. If for example, going back to the little kind of joke with the Monty Python and the fish, the contrast is that Michael Palin's got this small kind of sardine size fish that he's slapping John Cleese's face, and then John Cleese produces this enormous this fish that's 30 times bigger than this little sardine and slaps him once. So there's a lot of contrast in that visual. Palin is slapping the guy's face multiple times with a small fish, and Cleese is just hitting him once with this great big fish. And I think that's something to look out for if you're searching, if you're sat in this position and looking to see why something's funny and why it's not funny. That's another aspect of it. It's about contrast, visual. I think you have a sense of humor. You will find things that are funny, and that's a lot to do with probably what you watched. I mean, you and I both watched a lot of Laurel and Hardy when we were kids, and I still will look at that and find it funny. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, but you're getting the signals. You know when they're going to drop the piano or whatever it is. So all of those things, you're looking for the signals. You're looking all the other aspects around telling that story, and that the humor is fitting and working with the story.
It's also very clear from what you just said the importance of character, of the audience knowing what the character's expectations are, what their abilities are, how they're going to react. Like with Laurel and Hardy, they are very, very different characters, and they're going to react in a very, very particular way, and you're expecting it. And I know this is one part of physical and visual comedy that we slightly diverge on, is the use of breaking the fourth wall. And yeah, it's a great Laurel and Hardy trope, and Ollie does it all the time, and that is for me one of the funniest times when it's he does it so many times when Stan does something so ridiculous. Just a little look, the beat. We are brought in, the audience is brought in, and we, oh my God, yeah, feel your pain. Absolutely feel your pain. But we know he's going to do that.
Mhm.
Very rarely Stan does that because that's not his character. And we know, and you said with Mr. Bean and the setup that if someone imposes on him, his character is going to be victorious in the end. And the audience knows how that character is going to react in a certain situation. And it's in live action, but it's also in the animated versions of Mr. Bean, the animated series, but also in so much else. Even in Tex Avery, when Droopy is having a scrap with a couple of bad dogs, and you know how he's going to react. He's going to just be slow, and they're all going to be all manic and everything. But you know how they're gonna react. So everything does come down to character. That with visual comedy, especially with animation, and we say, yeah, with animation, you can do anything. Yes, you can do anything. So many times in shows that I've had, even in Bob the Builder, someone came to me, the producer said, yes, but we can't do that because of this and this and this. I said, so let me get this straight. You have a problem with this person doing this with the talking digger. That bears no resemblance to real life. This is a cartoon, so we can do that. We can push it a little bit further. That's what we can do in this medium. We can go that extra step, and that for me is when you can bring your imagination and you can bring the library of the absolutely absurd in. And that's such a joy to me when I get that situation. There are so many different aspects of comedy in animation, and that's what keeps us going. That's what keeps us in this field, in this industry at our greatly advanced age, is because we know that there is so much fun to be had.
I do need to show you something, which,
Oh,
talking about the absurd and talking about Tex Avery, talking about Droopy, I need to show you something. So, do you know what that's from?
oh, that's the guy when he was in that's the guy in prison in the jail, isn't it? I can't remember
It's
what the name
from
of it was.
Northwest Hounded Police. And it's a
Oh,
sequence when he's on the escape from, and he shuts multiple doors.
oh yes. Oh,
So
brilliant. And
that's
he,
that's a
he
that's an
and he
original animation drawing.
wow, fantastic. Where did you get that? Did you steal it from a museum?
No, I didn't. I had to buy
Oh,
it
wow.
from.
Oh, that's brilliant. I love that. And then every time, and then he does all this frantic stuff, and he
And then he
pops up at
turns
the end and
around.
goes, "Hello, Joe," and he's always there. and then he's off again. Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. That's the epitome of Tex Avery right there.
As we were talking about physical comedy today, I
Oh,
thought I would bring
brilliant.
that in just to
That
sort of
is fantastic.
to show you.
Oh, dear. Right. If Mr. Bean were here and we asked our usual question, tea or coffee?
I think Mr. Bean as a character, I would certainly say probably tea. We did do a story once where he went to a coffee bar, which he found a kind of a very unique experience. I know the rest of us in the 21st century, used to meeting up in coffee bars, but for him, it was a kind of unique experience. So I am very much going to say a cup of tea.
Oh, right. And what about toast? Assuming we can show toast being cooked.
Well,
Does Mr. Bean have a preference for that?
the obvious answer is beans, but it's I think, to be honest, having him making toast, and he's done it a few times, he quite likes jam. I'd imagine he likes jam. I'm pretty sure we've put jam on the toast before, so I'm going to go with jam.
Excellent. Well, that's pretty definitive. I'm sure there will be contacts from agents if there is an issue with tea and toast with jam on it. Okay, thank you, David, for a fantastically insightful conversation about physical and visual comedy in animation. There is much more to be discussed on this topic, and we will be returning to this. But at the moment, if you have liked this, please like and subscribe to our channel and keep coming back and tell everyone you've ever met all about how wonderful this is.
And as always, we're not saving lives.
It's just a cartoon. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.